She was handcuffed beside her own luxury car because one officer believed she didn't belong behind the wheel. But less than 10 minutes later, the most powerful police officer in the country stepped out of a black SUV, looked at the elderly woman in cuffs, and said just 2 words that left everyone speechless. "Mom ... Are you all right?" What happened next shattered assumptions, stunned the crowd, and sparked a conversation the entire nation couldn't ignore. It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon until a single traffic stop transformed into a scene no one could believe. An elderly black grandmother stood quietly beside a polished luxury sedan, her hands resting gently against the door as curious strangers slowed to watch. Before she could even finish explaining herself, a young police officer stepped forward with absolute confidence and accused her of stealing the vehicle. His voice carried certainty, but her response never changed. She simply looked him in the eyes and said the car belonged to her. He dismissed every word. Within moments, the metal click of handcuffs echoed across the parking lot. Phones appeared from every direction as stunned bystanders began recording what they believed was another painful example of someone being judged before being heard. The grandmother never shouted, resisted, or pleaded. Her calm expression seemed almost mysterious, as though she understood something nobody else did. The video spread across social media before anyone knew the truth. Millions would soon debate the encounter, choosing sides without realizing they were missing the most important piece of the story. No one imagined that the woman being handcuffed would soon receive a visitor, capable of changing every person's life at that scene. But the officer had no idea that one phone call was already on its way. The young officer had only recently earned his badge, and every shift felt like another opportunity to prove he belonged. Determined to make a name for himself, he trusted his instincts more than his patience. As he looked from the elderly black grandmother to the gleaming luxury sedan, he quietly convinced himself that something did not add up. In his mind, the picture simply did not fit. Instead of questioning his assumptions, he treated them like facts. He asked for her identification again, this time with sharper impatience. The grandmother reached carefully into her purse, moving slowly, so there could be no misunderstanding. She handed him every document he requested without raising her voice. Her answers were respectful, direct, and consistent. The vehicle was hers. She had owned it 4 years. She was simply returning from visiting family. The officer barely looked at her before calling for a verification. His attention stayed fixed on the image he had already created in his head. To him, her calmness felt rehearsed instead of genuine. Every composed answer only strengthened his misplaced confidence that he had uncovered something suspicious. Around them, the crowd continued to grow. Some people held their phones high, recording every second. Others exchanged uneasy glances, whispering that the situation did not seem right. A few quietly reminded the officer that ownership could be verified without humiliating an elderly woman in public. Their concerns were ignored just as quickly as hers. Minutes passed, but dispatch still had not confirmed the vehicle registration. Technical delays stretched the silence, making every second feel heavier than the last. The grandmother stood peacefully, despite the handcuffs pressing against her wrists. She never insulted the officer, never demanded special treatment, and never lost control. Her quiet dignity contrasted sharply with his growing frustration. Meanwhile, the videos racing across social media began attracting thousands of comments. Some viewers defended the officer before knowing the facts, while many others questioned why an elderly woman who remained so cooperative was being treated like a criminal. The debate intensified with every passing minute, and the pressure surrounding the scene grew impossible to ignore. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, a black SUV rolled slowly into the parking lot, and everything suddenly became silent. The black SUV rolled to a smooth stop just beyond the growing crowd. Another patrol vehicle followed close behind, then a third. Curious whispers swept through the parking lot as uniformed senior officers stepped out with serious expressions. The young officer straightened his posture, convinced their arrival would confirm he had handled the situation exactly as expected. Several bystanders exchanged worried glances, fearing the elderly woman was about to face even greater humiliation. Then the rear door of the SUV opened. The country police chief emerged, adjusting his jacket as he surveyed the scene. His eyes moved across the gathered officers, the flashing patrol lights, and the dozens of phones recording every second. Finally, his gaze landed on the handcuffed grandmother standing quietly beside her car. Everything about him changed. The calm confidence on his face disappeared, replaced by confusion, then unmistakable disbelief. Without asking anyone for an explanation, he walked directly toward her. Every step felt deliberate. Conversations stopped. Even the distant sounds of traffic seemed to fade beneath the growing silence. The young officer hurried forward, eager to explain why he believed the arrest had been necessary. Before he could finish a single sentence, the chief gently raised a hand, signaling him to stop. He stood before the elderly woman for a long moment, studying the marks left by the handcuffs on her wrists. His expression softened with genuine concern. Then, in a voice quiet enough to reveal deep emotion, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, he asked, "Mom, are you all right?" The words seemed to freeze time itself. A wave of stunned silence swept across the parking lot. Witnesses stared at one another in disbelief. Phones remained lifted, capturing every reaction. The young officer's confidence vanished in an instant as confusion gave way to panic. He suddenly realized that the woman he had treated like a suspect was someone the highest-ranking officer in the department addressed with love and respect. Without hesitation, the chief reached for the handcuffs and carefully unlocked them himself. The cold metal slipped away, leaving only quiet dignity in its place. He gently held her hands, checking to make sure she had not been hurt, before pulling her into a warm embrace that spoke louder than any speech ever could. The grandmother smiled softly and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, almost as though she were comforting him instead of herself. Around them, several witnesses wiped tears from their eyes. Others lowered their phones for a moment, overwhelmed by the unexpected display of humanity unfolding before them. The young officer stood frozen, replaying every decision he had made. His assumptions, spoken with such certainty only minutes earlier, now echoed painfully inside his mind. The viral videos that had once seemed destined to celebrate another successful arrest were becoming something entirely different. But the most powerful lesson wasn't the embrace. It was what the chief said next. The chief looked around at the silent crowd, before turning back to the officers gathered behind him. His voice was calm, but every word carried unmistakable weight. "She isn't my biological mother," he began. "But long before I ever wore this badge, she became the person who taught me what real leadership was like." I remained fixed on him. When our neighborhood struggled, she opened her home to children who needed guidance. She made sure we finished our homework before we played. She reminded us that discipline mattered, that education opened doors, and that serving others was the greatest measure of success. She believed every child deserved someone who believed in them. I was one of those children. He paused, looking at the grandmother with quiet gratitude. "If I'm standing here today as your chief, it's because she saw potential in me before I ever saw it in myself." The words settled over the crowd like a powerful reminder that no uniform could erase the lessons of compassion. The chief slowly faced the young officer. "This badge gives us authority," he said, touching the badge on his chest, "but it never gives us permission to stop seeing people. The moment we replace facts with assumptions, we damage something far greater than one encounter. We damage the trust our communities place in us." No one interrupted. "We are sworn to protect every person equally. Respect cannot depend on someone's appearance, age, neighborhood, or the car they drive. If we forget that, we fail the very people we promised to serve." The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer filled with tension. It was filled with reflection. One by one, witnesses began applauding. The sound spread through the parking lot until it became impossible to ignore. Several officers lowered their heads, visibly absorbing the lesson. Others exchanged thoughtful glances, recognizing that what they had witnessed would stay with them long after the cameras disappeared. The young officer stepped forward slowly. The certainty that had filled his voice earlier was gone. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I judged you before I knew you. I failed to give you the fairness and respect you deserved. I'm truly sorry." The grandmother looked at him with gentle eyes. There was no anger in her expression, only compassion. "I accept your apology," she replied softly. "The important thing is that you learn from today. Every person you meet has a story you cannot see. Never let assumptions speak louder than your humanity." The officer nodded, humbled by the grace he had not earned, but had been given anyway. In that moment, the atmosphere transformed completely. What had begun as a public humiliation became a lesson in accountability, forgiveness, and the kind of leadership that inspires lasting change. True authority, everyone realized, is measured by character, not power. But the story was far from over. Because millions of people were now watching. By the following morning, the videos had spread across the country. Millions of people watched the same unforgettable moment: an elderly black grandmother standing in handcuffs, followed by a police chief stepping forward, removing those cuffs, and calling her mom. News programs replayed the footage, online conversations exploded, and countless viewers said the story reminded them how quickly assumptions can shape the course of someone's life. While many praised the chief for his courage and humility, just as many admired the grandmother's remarkable dignity. She had answered disrespect with patience, humiliation with grace, and anger with compassion. Her quiet strength became the most powerful part of the story. Community leaders soon organized public discussions about fairness, accountability, and mutual respect between law enforcement and the people they serve. Churches, schools, neighborhood organizations, and civic groups used the incident as a starting point for honest conversations about trust, understanding, and the responsibility shared by everyone to build stronger communities. Inside the department, leadership reviewed its training procedures, placing renewed emphasis on unbiased policing, careful decision-making, respectful communication, and de-escalation before judgment. Officers were reminded that every encounter carries the power either to strengthen public confidence or to weaken it. The young officer forgot that afternoon. Rather than allowing the mistake to define him, he chose to learn from it. He listened more carefully, questioned his own assumptions, and worked every day to rebuild the trust he had nearly broken. Growth, he realized, begins the moment pride gives way to humility. As for the grandmother, she never sought attention or recognition. When reporters asked what message she wanted people to remember, she smiled gently and said that forgiveness is never weakness. Wisdom begins when we see one another as human beings first, and every person deserves to be treated with dignity before being judged. Long after the headlines faded, the lesson endured. The incident became a lasting reminder that appearances should never determine how someone is treated, because justice is strongest when it is guided by humility, compassion, and respect, not assumptions. The officer thought he was arresting a suspect. Instead, he found himself standing before the woman who had helped shape the very leader sworn to uphold justice, and a nation was reminded that true greatness begins with seeing the humanity in every person.